a lot of the abolitionists here in Boston were really taken aback by John Brown's raid on Harpers Ferry. William Lloyd Garrison, of course, was a pacifist, and he pretty much disavowed anything that John Brown did. He couldn't really come out and support it because obviously John Brown did a violent thing. But for a lot of the other abolitionists, Thoreau, Wendell Phillips, Frederick Douglass, they were all at the point by 1859 that maybe violence was the way to go. If we're going to end slavery, maybe this is the way to do it. They still, to some degree, thought that John Brown was perhaps a little insane for doing it the way that he did it, but the only one who did not really consider him insane was Henry Thoreau.
Today is November 1st, 1859. Mr. Henry D. Thoreau is 42 years old and has lived in Concord, Massachusetts his entire life. He is the author of 2 books. His first, A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers, was published in 1849. His latest book is entitled Walden, or Life in the Woods, and it was published by Ticknor and Fields of Boston in 1854. Mr. Thoreau has written numerous essays, and his works have appeared in such prestigious periodicals as Graham's Monthly Magazine, the Boston Miscellany of Literature and Fashion, the Atlantic Monthly, and the United States Magazine and Democratic Review. As Mr. Thoreau rarely leaves his customary seclusion in order to address the public, what he has to say will likely be of great interest. We trust the complete attention by his auditors will give no offense to the speaker. Gentlemen and ladies, Mr. Henry D. Thoreau of Concord, Massachusetts.
I trust that you will pardon me for being here. I do not wish to force my thoughts upon you, but I feel forced myself. Little as I know of Captain Brown, I would fain do my part to correct the tone and the statements of the newspapers and of my countrymen generally respecting his character and actions. It costs us nothing to be just. We can at least express our sympathy with and admiration of him and his companions, and that is what I now propose to do. First, as to his history, I will endeavor to omit as much as possible what you have already read. I need not describe his person to you, for probably most of you have seen and will not soon forget him. I am told that his grandfather, John Brown, was an officer in the Revolution, that he himself was born in Connecticut about the beginning of this century, but early went with his father to Ohio. I heard him say that his father was a contractor who furnished beef to the army there in the War of 1812, that he accompanied him in the camp and assisted him in that employment, seeing a good deal of military life, more perhaps than if he had been a soldier, for he was often present at the councils of the officers. Especially he learned by experience how armies are supplied and maintained in the field, a work which he observed requires at least as much experience and skill as to lead them in battle. He said that few persons had any conception of the cost, even the pecuniary cost, of firing a single bullet in war. He saw enough at any rate to disgust him with a military life, indeed, to excite in him a great abhorrence of it, so much so that, though he was tempted by the offer of some petty office in the army when he was about 18, he not only declined that, but he also refused to train when warned and was fined for it. He then resolved that he would never have anything to do with any war unless it were a war for liberty. When the troubles in Kansas began, he sent several of his sons thither to strengthen the party of the Free State men, fitting them out with such weapons as he had, telling them that if the troubles should increase and there should be need of this, he would follow to assist them with his hand and counsel. This, as you all know, he soon after did, and it was through his agency, far more than any others, that Kansas was made free. I should say that he was an old-fashioned man in respect for the Constitution and his faith in the permanence of this Union. Slavery he deemed to be wholly opposed to these, and he was its determined foe. He was by descent and birth a New England farmer, a man of great common sense, deliberate and practical as that class is, and tenfold more so. He was like the best of those who stood at Concord Bridge once, on Lexington Common, and on Bunker Hill, only he was firmer and higher principled than any that I have chanced to hear of as there. It was no abolition lecturer that converted him. Ethan Allen and Stark, with whom he may in some respects be compared, were rangers in a lower and less important field. They could bravely face their country's foes, but he had the courage to face his country herself when she was in the wrong. A Westerner writes to say that, to account for his escape from so many perils, that he was concealed under a rural exterior, as if in that prairie land a hero should by good rights wear citizen's dress only. He did not go to the college called Harvard, good old alma mater that she is. He was not fed on the pap that is there furnished. As he phrased it, I know no more of grammar than one of your calves. But he went to the great University of the West, where he sedulously pursued the study of liberty, for which he had early betrayed a fondness. And having taken many degrees, he finally commenced the public practice of humanity in Kansas, as you all know. Such were his humanities, and not any study of grammar. He was one of that class of men of whom we hear a great deal, but for the most part see nothing at all, the Puritans. It would be in vain to kill him. He died lately in the time of Cromwell, but he reappeared here. Why should he not? Some of the Puritan stock are said to have come here and settled in New England. They were a class that did something else than celebrate the forefathers' day and eat parched corn in remembrance of that time. They were neither Democrats nor Republicans, but men of simple habits, straightforward, prayerful, not thinking much of rulers who did not fear God, not making many compromises, nor seeking after available candidates. He was a man of Spartan habits, and at 60 was scrupulous about his diet at your table, excusing himself by saying that he must eat sparingly and fare hard, as became a soldier, or one who was fitting himself for difficult enterprises, a life of exposure. A man of rare common sense and directness of speech as of action, a transcendentalist above all, a man of ideas and principles, that was what distinguished him. Not yielding to a whim or transient impulse, but carrying out the purpose of a life. I noticed that he did not overstate anything, but spoke within bounds. I remember particularly how, in his speech in Concord, he referred to what his family had suffered in Kansas, without ever giving the least vent to his pent-up fire. He was a volcano with an ordinary chimney flue. Also, referring to the deeds of certain border ruffians, he said rapidly, paring away his speech like an experienced soldier, keeping a reserve of force and meaning, they had a perfect right to be hung. He was not in the least a rhetorician. He was not talking to Buncombe or his constituents anywhere, had no need to invent anything but to tell the simple truth and communicate his own resolution. Therefore, he appeared incomparably strong, and eloquence in Congress and elsewhere seemed to me to be at a discount. When I expressed surprise that he could live in Kansas at all, with a price set upon his head and so large a number, including the authorities exasperated against him, he accounted for it by saying, "It is perfectly well understood that I will not be taken." Much of the time for some years, he has had to skulk in swamps, suffering from poverty and from sickness, which was the consequence of exposure, befriended only by Indians and a few white men. But though it might be known that he was lurking in a particular swamp, his foes commonly did not go in after him. He could even come into a town where there were more border ruffians than free state men and transact some business without delaying long and yet not be molested. For, said he, no little handful of men were willing to undertake it, and a large body could not be got together in season. As for his recent failure at Harpers Ferry, we do not know the facts about it. It was evidently far from being a wild and desperate attempt. His enemies are compelled to say that it was, quote, among the best planned and executed conspiracies that ever failed. Yet, he did not attribute his success foolishly to his star or to any magic. He said truly that the reason why such greatly superior numbers quailed before him was, as one of the prisoners confessed, because they lacked a cause, a kind of armor which he and his party never lacked. When the time came, few men were found willing to lay down their lives in defense of what they knew was to be wrong. They did not like that this should be their last act in this world, but to make haste to his last act and its effects. The newspapers seem to ignore, or perhaps are really ignorant of the fact, that there are at least as many as 2 or 3 individuals to a town throughout the North who think much as I do about him and his enterprise. I do not hesitate to say that they are an important and growing party. We aspire to be something more than stupid and timid chattel, pretending to read history and our Bibles, but desecrating every house and every day that we breathe in. Perhaps anxious politicians may prove that only 17 white men and 5 Negroes were concerned in the late enterprise, but this very anxiety to prove this might suggest to themselves that all is not told. Why do they still dodge the truth? They are so anxious because of a dim consciousness of the fact, which they do not distinctly face, that at least 1 million of the free inhabitants of the United States would have rejoiced if he had succeeded. They at most only criticize the tactics. Though we wear no crepe, the thought of that man's position and probable fate is spoiling many a man's day here at the North for other thinking. If anyone who has seen him here can pursue successfully any other train of thought, I do not know what he is made of. If there is any such who gets his usual allowance of sleep, I will warrant him to fatten easily under any circumstances which do not touch his body or his purse. As for me, I put a piece of paper and a pencil under my pillow, and when I could not sleep, I wrote in the dark. On the whole, my respect for my fellow man is not being increased these days. I have noticed the cold-blooded way in which newspaper writers and men generally speak of this event as if an ordinary malefactor, though one of unusual pluck, as the governor of Virginia is reported to have said, the gamest man he ever saw, had been caught and were about to be hung. He was not dreaming of his foes when the governor thought he looked so brave. It turns what sweetness I have to gall, to hear of the remarks of some of my neighbors. When we heard at first that he was dead, one of my townsmen observed that he died as the fool dieth, which, pardon me for an instant, suggests a likeness in him dying to my neighbor living. Others, craven-hearted, said disparagingly that he threw his life away because he resisted the government. Which way have they thrown their lives? Such as would praise a man for attacking singly an ordinary band of thieves or murderers? I hear another ask Yankee-like, what will he gain by it? As if he expected to fill his pockets by this enterprise. Such a one has no idea of gain but in this worldly sense. If it does not lead to a surprise party, if it does not get a new pair of boots or a vote of thanks, it must be a failure. But he won't gain anything by it. Well, no. I don't suppose he could get 4 and 6 pence a day for being hung, take the year round. But then he stands a chance to save a considerable part of his soul, and such a soul, when you do not. Our foes are in our midst and all about us. There is hardly a house but is divided against itself, for our foe is the all but universal woodenness of both head and heart, the want of vitality in man, which is the effect of our vice. And hence are begotten fear, superstition, bigotry, persecution, and slavery of all kinds. We are mere figureheads upon a hulk with livers in the place of hearts. The curse is the worship of idols, which at length changes the worshiper into a stone image himself, and the New Englander is just as much an idolater as the Hindu. Captain Brown was an exception, for he did not set up even a political graven image between him and his God. a church that can never have done with excommunicating Christ while it exists. Away with your broad and flat churches and your narrow and tall churches. Take a step forward and invent a new style of outhouse. Invent a salt that will save you and defend our nostrils. The modern Christian is a man who has consented to say all the prayers in his liturgy, providing you will let him go straight to bed and sleep quietly afterward. All his prayers begin with, "Now I lay me down to sleep," and he is forever looking forward to the time when he shall go to his long rest. He has consented to perform certain old established charities too, after a fashion, but he does not wish to hear of any newfangled ones. He doesn't wish to have any supplementary articles added to the contract to fit to the present time. He shows the whites of his eyes on the Sabbath and the blacks all the rest of the week. The evil is not merely a stagnation of blood, but a stagnation of spirit. Many, no doubt, are well disposed, but sluggish by constitution and by habit, and they cannot conceive of a man who is actuated by higher motives than they are. Accordingly, they pronounce Captain Brown insane, for they know that they could never act as he does as long as they are themselves. As for the newspapers, I object not so much as to what they have omitted as to what they have inserted. Even the Liberator called it a misguided, wild, and apparently insane effort. As for the herd of newspapers and magazines, I do not chance to know an editor in the country who will deliberately print anything which he knows will be ultimately and permanently reduce the number of his subscribers. They do not believe that it would be expedient. How then can they print the truth? If we do not say pleasant things, they argue, nobody will attend to us. And so they do like the traveling auctioneers who sing an obscene song in order to draw a crowd around them. Republican editors, obliged to get their sentences ready for the morning edition and accustomed to looking at everything by the twilight of politics, express no admiration nor true sorrow even, but call these men deluded fanatics, mistaken men, insane, or crazed. It suggests what a sane set of editors we are blessed with, not mistaken men who know very well on which side their bread is buttered. A man does a brave and humane deed, and at once on all sides we hear parties and people declaring, "I did not do it, nor countenance him to do it in any conceivable way. It can't be fairly inferred from my past career." I, for one, am not interested to hear you define your position. I do not know that I ever was or that I ever shall be. I think it is mere egotism or impertinent at this time. You needn't take so much pains to wash your skirts of him. No intelligent man will ever be convinced that he was any creature of yours. He went and came, as he himself informs us, under the auspices of John Brown and nobody else. Prominent and influential editors, accustomed to dealing with politicians, men of an infinitely lower grade, say in their ignorance that Captain Brown acted on the principle of revenge. They do not know the man. They must enlarge themselves to conceive of him. I have no doubt that the time will come when they will begin to see him as he was. They have got to conceive of a man of faith and religious principle and not a politician, of a man who did not wait till he was personally interfered with or thwarted in some harmless business before he gave his life to the cause of the oppressed. If Walker may be considered the representative of the South, I wish I could say that Captain Brown is the representative of the North. He was a superior man. He did not value his bodily life in comparison with ideal things. He did not recognize unjust human laws, but resisted them as he was bid. For once, we are lifted out of the trivialness and dust of politics into the region of truth and manhood. No man in America has ever stood up so persistently and effectively for the dignity of the human race, knowing himself for a man and the equal of any and all governments. In that sense, Captain Brown was the most American of us all. He needed no babbling lawyer making false issues to defend him. He was more than a match for all the judges that American voters or office holders of whatever grade can create. He could not have been tried by a jury of his peers because his peers do not exist. I am aware that I anticipate a little that he was still, at the last account, alive in the hands of his foes. But that being the case, I have all along found myself thinking and speaking of him as physically dead. I do not believe in erecting statues to those who still live in our hearts, whose bones have not yet crumbled into the earth around us, but I would rather see the statue of Captain Brown in the Massachusetts State House yard than that of any other man whom I know. I rejoice that I live in this age and that I am his contemporary. I am here to plead his cause with you. I plead not for his life, but for his character, his immortal life, and so it becomes your cause wholly and is not his in the least. Some 1,800 years ago, Christ was crucified. This morning, perchance, Captain Brown was hung. These are the two ends of a chain which is not without its links. He is not Old Brown any longer. Now, he is an angel of light. I see now that it was necessary that the bravest and humanest man in all the country should be hung. Perhaps he saw it himself. I almost fear that I may yet hear of his deliverance, doubting if a prolonged life, if any life, can do as much good as his death. Misguided, garrulous, insane, vindictive. So you write in your easy chairs, and thus he wounded responds from the floor of the Harpers Ferry armory, clear as a cloudless sky, true as the voice of nature. Quote, "No man sent me here. It was my own prompting and that of my Maker. I acknowledge no master in human form." And in what a sweet and noble strain he proceeds, addressing his captors who stand over him, quote, "I think, my friends, you are guilty of a great wrong against God and humanity, and it would be perfectly right for anyone to interfere with you so far as to free those you willfully and wickedly hold in bondage." And referring to his movement, quote, "It is, in my opinion, the greatest service a man can render to God. I pity the poor in bondage and who that have none to help them. That is why I am here, not to gratify any personal animosity, revenge, or vindictive spirit. It is my sympathy with the oppressed and the wronged that are as good as you and as precious in the sight of God. I want you to understand that I respect the rights of the poorest and weakest of colored people, oppressed by the slave power just as much as I do those of the most wealthy and powerful. I wish to say furthermore that you had better, all you people in the South, prepare yourselves for a settlement of that question that must come up for settlement sooner than you are prepared for. The sooner you are prepared, the better. You may dispose of me very easily. I am very nearly disposed of now. But this question is still to be settled. This Negro question, I mean. The end of that is not yet. I foresee the time when the painter will paint that scene, no longer going to Rome for a subject. The poet will sing it, the historian will record it, and with the landing of the Pilgrims and the Declaration of Independence, it will be the ornament of some future national gallery when at least the present form of slavery shall be no more. We shall then be at liberty to weep for Captain Brown. Then, and not till then, we will take our revenge. Thank you very much. After my readings, I tend to answer questions in character as Henry Thoreau. However, this is pretty intense, and so what I'm going to do is ask you to close your eyes, and I'm going to count down from 3, 2, 1. Open your eyes. Welcome back to 2017. My name is Richard Smith. I'm a historian. How was your trip to 1859? So, pretty intense, huh? What do you think? I am willing to engage in questions and discussion at this point. A lot of people are actually very surprised. They know of Henry David Thoreau as the hermit of Walden Pond, who writes about civil disobedience and living alone and growing beans. But a lot of people are pretty unaware of the fact that he was such a strong supporter of Captain John Brown. Those of you that know of Mr. Thoreau living in the woods and growing beans, how many of you were surprised by the violence and the anger in this lecture? Anybody? Pretty surprising? Yeah? So you know of Thoreau? You kind of went, yeah.
The reality is, even if you're very progressive or liberal in the woods, if you have no experience with people of color, you still have that kind of like, maybe you might be progressive on a vote, but you might be a little bit closeted racist or bigoted. You know what I mean?
Right.
And I mean, even in that time, like the political spectrum is not the same thing as today's context. So it's like even more like not necessarily confusing, but kind of like questionable. Right. But yeah, it's complicated.
And I gotta say, a lot of the abolitionists in the North, a lot of the abolitionists here in Boston, were really taken aback by John Brown's raid on Harpers Ferry. William Lloyd Garrison, of course, was a pacifist, and he pretty much disavowed anything that John Brown did. He couldn't really come out and support it because obviously John Brown did a violent thing. But for a lot of the other abolitionists, Thoreau, Wendell Phillips, Frederick Douglass, they were all at the point by 1859 that maybe violence was the way to go. If we're going to end slavery, maybe this is the way to do it. They still, to some degree, thought that John Brown was perhaps a little insane for doing it the way that he did it. But the only one who did not really consider him insane was Henry Thoreau. And he had met John Brown twice. And talking to him, he didn't get a sense that Brown was insane or crazy or anything like that. And even recent biographers have said that John Brown was not insane, that here was a man who was literally following the Old Testament, an eye for an eye. So if you're going to put black people in bondage and kill them, then it's our duty as Christians to kill the slaveholder.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of agnostic, but like, the reason why I at all would view him as questionable, John Brown himself, is because of the whole religious experience. However, also, America back then was very religious. I mean, I legit have no problem with him killing slave owners. But I do, even as a like progressive white guy in this day and age, I feel like it's like there was an interesting question in our class. It was like, how far does your allyship go into black liberation? And it's just like, if I was in John Brown's shoes, sure. Would I give guns and training, like formal training? Yes. But would I be the guy to lead the attack? Probably not.
Right.
Would I have killed some slave owners? Probably. I got some swords. What's up? But that's about as far as I'm taking it. I think, like, even in modern day context, like with this election that's just passed, and like, there's the people who are casually liberal who are like, hey, this is a bad thing. But the reality is, in a situation like John Brown's case, like an institution of slavery, you can argue that any person that died under the bondage of slavery died a slave, so therefore, slavery has killed millions of people. So,
and I think we forget that. We tend to forget in the 21st century the horrors of American slavery. And so somebody like John Brown was very aware of the horrors of American slavery. He was talking to runaway slaves who had experienced it firsthand. And so, and it had been going on for so long that a lot of people, even up here in the North, had just kind of gotten used to it. Whereas people like John Brown and Thoreau and others who helped runaway slaves, they saw it firsthand. They talked to Frederick Douglass. Yeah. I have a feeling that if you're talking to Frederick Douglass about growing up as a slave, you're pretty much going to become an abolitionist.
Yeah.
He's the guy that's going to convince you. And everybody that we've been talking about, they all knew Frederick Douglass firsthand. So does anybody have any questions or comments or anything that we can go into? Yes.
We have one over here.
Go ahead.
Do you have some idea how many people would have heard this lecture the 3 times it was delivered?
Yeah. When he gave it in Concord at the First Parish Church, they said it was a full house. I'm thinking maybe a couple of hundred people. When he did it at Tremont Temple, there were 2,500 people there. That was the largest audience that he ever spoke in front of. And then we did it in Worcester. I've heard it was around 1,000. So probably 4,000 people altogether, give or take. But it was also printed in various newspapers around the country. So a lot of people would have been very aware of the lecture. They might not necessarily have been aware of who Thoreau was outside of Massachusetts. Even by 1859, he wasn't that famous. Especially down in the South, he was known as more of an abolitionist than a nature writer or the guy who lived in the woods. Walden wasn't really a bestseller. But this kind of definitely put him, at least publicly for a while, among the ranks of well-known abolitionists, absolutely. And certainly here in Boston and in Concord and Worcester, a lot of people knew who he was already. I think it was the Liberator or one of the newspapers that said that John Brown seems to have awoken the hermit of Concord. So at least they knew here in this area who he was, absolutely. So about 3,000 or 4,000 people saw him. I can't imagine being at Tremont Temple and not having one of these and speaking in front of 2,500 people. I would imagine the people in the back had a hard time.
Sorry, a lot easier. So just a quick question in regards to John Brown. Do we know about what percentage of abolitionists were in support of his methods? I know that you said that William Lloyd Garrison was more of a pacifist with the Liberator. But do you have like a general ratio? Do we have a general idea of who is against, who is for him? I know that Ralph Waldo Emerson, once he switched over, he was able to convince a lot of people.
Do you mean actual like well-known abolitionists themselves?
Yeah, I was just wondering like how many amongst the abolitionists, within the New England area were in support of John Brown's idea.
I can tell you that in Boston in particular, a lot of the black abolitionists absolutely supported him, but none of them went with him to Harpers Ferry. Frederick Douglass even warned him and said that you're going to go into a trap and you shouldn't do it. White abolitionists were split. People like Garrison were pacifists. They wanted to pretty much not do violent things. People like Wendell Phillips thought that violence might be a good way to go. So I would say the majority, even though they were abolitionists and they, at least in theory, supported him, again, you don't find a lot of them giving him money or weapons or anything like that. Of course, we know about the Secret Six, was the group of abolitionists in Concord, in Boston, and New York, who gave him the money and the weapons specifically for Harpers Ferry. So we know of at least 6 guys that supported him. But as for in theory, a lot of people thought it might have been a good idea. But again, when he was captured, a lot of abolitionists kind of turned their back on him and said, I wasn't involved. Of the Secret Six, 5 of them either disavowed dealing with Brown or they left the country. Only one of the Secret Six stayed in Worcester, Thomas Wentworth Higginson. He stayed in Worcester and said, okay, you want to get me? Come get me. He was the only one that stood by Brown physically and intellectually and said, yeah, I gave him money. What are you going to do about it? All the others kind of went away and hid for a while. So, because federal marshals were looking for these guys. You had an interesting question you asked me before I began.
I have a different question now, but I can ask both. So, as a fellow historian, I'm interested in the ways that stories are told and what histories survive, what histories die. And I'm interested to know about the stories that aren't as a part of this narrative of African Americans taking arms to fight against their own oppression. And it feels like a blurb in history where John Brown is the key protagonist here, and the 7 slaves that accompanied him. I wondered if you have any information regarding those individuals and their narratives of how they came into contact with Brown, and their stories as they pertain to this event. And then the second question is about the ideas of transcendentalism, of self-reliance, fitting into sort of other narratives of rebellion against slavery.
Sure.
From the Stono Rebellion to the rebellion of Nat Turner. And also sort of Thoreau's claim as he is the first true American in that sense, being tied to this greater idea of white saviorship in opposition to, I guess, black leadership.
Right. As for the first part of the question, okay, there were 21 men with John Brown. Only 5 escaped Harpers Ferry. The rest were either killed at Harpers Ferry or were captured and hanged along with John Brown. We actually know enough about almost all of them, and there are photographs of the people that were involved with John Brown. So there's enough information to put together. One was a runaway slave whose idea was that he was going to go with John Brown and hopefully eventually free his wife and children from bondage. So the others were definitely on the fringe of society, who were trying to do something about slavery. I wouldn't call any of them well known in their lifetime. None of them were famous by any stretch of the imagination. And a lot of Southern newspapers will kind of tell you at the time that these were kind of like the dregs of society, who were losers and troublemakers, and they were just trying to cause trouble with John Brown. But a lot of them were absolutely involved with John Brown because they were dedicated to ending slavery. He would kind of put you through the ringer and ask you, well, why are you doing this? Why do you want to be involved? He wanted men who were 100% willing to put down their lives to end slavery. So everyone that was with him was totally committed to the cause, and I think a lot of them knew that they weren't going to get out of there alive. So, and yeah, there's plenty of information about them online. There's a couple of really great websites. Just Google John Brown's Men, and all kinds of great stuff will come up about them, including pictures and things like that. As for transcendentalism and anti-slavery, yeah, you notice that Thoreau calls John Brown a transcendentalist above all. Thoreau's idea of transcendentalism was that you are self-reliant, you are going to stand up for what you believe in, you're going to take responsibility for your own actions, your own self-culture, regardless of what anybody else thinks. So for him, John Brown was the ultimate transcendentalist because here's a guy who's had enough. For John Brown's entire life, slavery has been growing by leaps and bounds. And the United States government was always very good at compromising with the slaveholder so that the South would not secede or there would be no war or anything like that. And John Brown finally had enough. He was tired of the United States government not only compromising with slaveholders, but doing things like the fugitive slave law, or letting states come into the unions as slave states. He'd had enough. So he thought, maybe it's time that I do something about it, instead of waiting around for the government to take any action. So for Thoreau, that's what transcendentalism is all about. To thine own self be true. Or as Emerson would say, trust thyself. Every heart vibrates to that iron string. That's from his essay, Self-Reliance. And so to Thoreau and Emerson and the Alcotts, they all believed that John Brown was being the ultimate in self-reliance by going into the South and trying to end slavery himself and not waiting for anybody else to do it. And to be a man of action. Thoreau was all about being a man of action. If you're going to have a belief, then you better put your actions behind it. Instead of sitting around in your house all day, reading the newspaper and saying slavery is horrible, well, what are you going to do about it? You're just going to sit at home, or are you going to go out and try to make a change? And that's what he liked about Brown. Brown was going out trying to make a change.
Were there any records on where he realistically saw himself ending? Because I find it hard to believe.
You have to speak up just a little bit.
Yeah, no, I find it hard to believe that he expected to end slavery all on his own, or at least with what he started. But is there any record realistically where he expected to finish? Could he possibly have just expected to be a martyr?
The idea was that he was going to go to the Federal Armory in Harpers Ferry, get a lot of weapons, rifles and muskets that were there, go into the countryside, give these weapons to slaves, kill their slave masters, have a big rebellion, and then go and hide in the mountains. And hopefully the word would get out to all these other slaves, go to Virginia, to the mountains. That's where we're starting our own uprising. The biggest fear in the South throughout the 19th century, the biggest fear amongst white men in the South was slave uprising. They were more afraid of that than anything else. So suddenly, the Southerners in Virginia are getting the word that these abolitionists are given weapons to runaway slaves. They absolutely believed, a lot of the white Southerners in Virginia absolutely believed that there were going to be gangs of runaway slaves with weapons coming into everybody's house and killing everybody. And that's exactly the kind of fear that John Brown wanted them to have. Now, the raid at the armory ended after only 2 days. Brown was wounded and captured and then hanged. So word did not really get out to any runaway slaves anywhere in the area that this was going on. Did Brown know that he was walking into a trap? Historians disagree on that. Some people think that he was doing it because he knew it was going to be a forceful symbol and inspire people. Some people think that he might have actually believed that it was going to happen. But when he had a chance to get out of Harpers Ferry with his men before the militia and the Marines showed up, he didn't do it. So maybe he thought that dying was the better way to go. And looking back on it now as a historian, his death was more of a symbol than going into the countryside and giving weapons to runaway slaves. If you read, so the Civil War started less than 2 years later. And then in 1862, after the Emancipation Proclamation, was when finally black men started to sign up to join the Union Army. I've read a lot of letters from black recruits, and so many of them mention John Brown. What John Brown started in 1859, now we can finish it. So at least for the black population, and especially the free black population up here in the North, he was absolutely a symbol and absolutely an inspiration, especially once the blacks were allowed to join the Union Army and fight. They almost all believed that they were continuing John Brown's actions. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.